How's it going, everyone? This is going to be a review of Alien Romulus. But we're not just going to be talking about the story and cinematic aspects, but also about the scientific accuracy and how it works with the plot. I believe it's okay to be lenient with scientific accuracy in fiction, as long as the liberties that one takes support the plot, because the story should take priority over everything else. That's why it's called science fiction. So first I'll give a short general review without spoilers, and then we will have a spoiler warning and we will get into the details. So whether you are a veteran of the Alien franchise or you've never seen an Alien film in your life, Alien Romulus is an entertaining thrill ride. You don't have to have seen any Alien movies to understand it and enjoy it, although if you have seen other Alien films, you will notice some details that tie it in with events in the other films. The sound and visuals work together to create both a terrifying and visually impressive atmosphere. It's especially noteworthy how the film uses silence. Space is silent because there's no air particles to propagate sound waves, but the silence also signifies being alone, which adds to the horror atmosphere. It reminds me of how silence is used in 2001: A Space Odyssey, and also of the original tagline from the first Alien film: "In space, no one can hear you scream." In general, the scientific accuracy is acceptable. There are some inaccurate moments, but they do support the plot and theme of the film. I wouldn't rank Romulus as a masterpiece like the first two Alien films, but I would rank it fourth best Alien film, with the top three being Alien, Aliens, and Prometheus. And I'm sure some people believe Prometheus does not deserve third place, but that's what I choose to believe. And yes, that is a Prometheus quote. Now on to the details, and spoiler alert. So first off, the main character, Rain, her name sounds a lot like Rey, as in Rey from that other sci-fi flick, Star Wars: The Force Awakens. And the similarities don't stop there. You've got a young woman, without her parents, stuck living in poverty and mistreatment while working on a wasteland planet. She decides to take her robot companion and escape on a stolen ship, and so begin her adventures. That is the setup for both films. But there's more. Remember what happens to Rey in The Force Awakens right after she escapes Jakku? She docks with another space-faring vessel, where caged monsters escape and attack the crew, and the protagonists need to get back to her ship for safety. So that is the entire premise of Alien Romulus. Okay, Alien Romulus is like a reboot of The Force Awakens, and I think it's a more entertaining reboot. Now, even the meanings of their names share parallels. Both names are a word for something that comes from the sky and relates to their home planet. Rey's planet is a desert world under the hot sun, and Rain's planet is a cloudy world that gets no sun. I would not be surprised if the writers of Romulus were aware of these parallels and wrote them in on purpose, as if to say, hey, writers of Force Awakens, this is how you're supposed to tell that type of story. But back to Romulus. Rain's planet is relatively small. It's a hard, rocky one, and it has rings. And we know it's relatively small because its gravity is comfortable for humans, unless there's some gravitational suppression device that is not mentioned. A small rocky planet having rings is possible, but it's unlikely. Rings are more likely to form around gas giants for a few reasons. Gas giants have a stronger gravity field, which makes it more likely that they would attract all the rocks and smaller particles needed for a ring. A stronger gravitational field also makes it more likely that the planet would be able to tear, or the planet's gravitational field would be able to tear apart potential moons from forming, turning them into the smaller pieces that rings are made out of. There's also a theory that during star formation, lighter, smaller particles like gas and smaller rocks are blown far away from the star, resulting in gas giants and rings forming far away from the star, while heavier materials stay close to the star, forming smaller, harder, rocky, ringless worlds. So small rocky planets with rings can exist, but they're just much more rare in the universe. Now, the crew that we see in this film is a younger crew than what we see in most Alien films. They seem like they're teens or early 20s. Now, this is a common age for the protagonists in the classic slasher horror films, but Alien movies in the past typically have had older characters, so it was interesting to see a group like this in an Alien movie, and themes from the more classic slasher films do appear in Romulus as well. Now, the space station looks a lot like the space station from Alien Isolation, which was recently ranked 6th greatest horror game of all time by IGN. It must have been an inspiration for the film. It makes sense that the same or similar space station design would be used for different space stations. Now, moving on, with the facehugger not having much time to implant the xenomorph, it kept audiences guessing as to what will happen next, including audiences who have seen Alien movies and know how xenomorphs are born. So even they were wondering, so what was that enough time? Is it going to be a chest burster or not yet? Right, so that was well done. Once the chest burster does come, it seems to grow very quickly without consuming much or anything. This happens in other Alien films too, and violates the law of conservation of mass. It can't increase its mass without consuming that amount of mass. In the first Alien movie, it eats its way to getting bigger, but that's not clear in this one. That said, it's okay because it does support the theme of the story. Part of what makes monsters scary is that they are not bound to the laws of nature that humans are aware of. Ghosts can move through walls. Vampires rise from the dead, and xenomorphs grow in violation of the laws of conservation of mass. Also, the xenomorph is probably symbolic of the consequences of not following the rules, or not adhering to some established norms. At the start of every Alien film, the crew breaks some rule, goes against some protocol, which leads to them encountering the xenomorph. And what follows is not only the battle against the monster, but also philosophical debates between the characters. In Romulus, the rule they all decide to break is escaping the planet on a stolen vessel. It's a common horror theme that the monster represents the consequences of not following the rules. Little Red Riding Hood doesn't listen to her mom when she says, "Stay on the path, don't go into the forest." So she leaves the path, goes into the forest, and encounters the big bad wolf. And there's actually a lot of parallels between the big bad wolf and the xenomorph, but that is a subject for another video. So, if the xenomorph represents negative consequences, and the xenomorph growing inexplicably represents negative consequences growing inexplicably, which really can happen, well, then the growth is not really against the laws of nature then, is it? Now, once the xenomorph gets born, it gets born from a sort of cocoon. And I know there's better ways to describe it than a cocoon. I'm just going to go with cocoon. And on one hand, it makes even less sense because there's no cocoon in the other Alien films. And it means there's even more mass that has to magically come from somewhere. But on the other hand, it's foreshadowing the so-called natural birth of the second xenomorph later in the movie. So you could say it works from that perspective, and the symbolism of that scene certainly matches the Alien film genre in general. Now, moving on, the auto-aim mechanism in the gun I think was pretty brilliant. I think something like that really could work. It would still require skill because the user would have to keep their chest and shoulder steady, but I could see it simplifying the process. The weightlessness or no gravity scene where Rain avoids the acid by shooting her gun so that the recoil pushes her back and away from the acid, that's accurate. That really could work that way. And it was a clever move by her and a cool scene. So finally, we reach the birth of the second xenomorph. This is the most disturbing and most powerful sequence in the film, and as such, it's correctly placed at the end. And by sequence, I mean everything involving that second xenomorph. It's a standard trope in alien movies that when you think the movie's over and the hero is safe, the monster comes out of nowhere and there's one more action sequence. It worked well. I was not expecting it, despite being fully aware of this trope. I thought the movie was over before that second xenomorph arrived. Now, that second xenomorph kind of looks like an engineer. For those unfamiliar with the lore, engineer is not a profession, but an alien race from the other alien films. If the mysterious goo is intended to alter human DNA in order to make humans more fit for space travel, perhaps the engineers are a successful result of such an experiment, while the second xenomorph is an unsuccessful result. The human face of the monster also makes it more terrifying than the other xenomorphs, because a human face makes us feel like it's one of us, and that we can trust it, and maybe that we should care about it. This is powerful because the monsters that horror movies or horror stories warn us about, they're actually human, right? The big bad wolf speaks and wears clothing and walks on 2 feet and pretends to be a loving, trustworthy, familiar companion. Horror stories warn us about the monsters hiding among us. And the human face of that second xenomorph makes this more obvious. And that is terrifying. Thematically, in many horror movies featuring rebellious youth facing monsters representing consequences of not following the rules, the youth are taking part in some sexual activity that go against traditional norms. The sexual activity is what either directly or symbolically gets them in trouble with the monster, and often the most traditionally well-behaved character is the one that survives at the end of the film. Now in this film, we see an unplanned pregnancy out of wedlock, implying that some activity took place prior. It might be a teen pregnancy too, although I'm not sure about the age of the character. And no matter how hard the heroes try to save the would-be mother, they can't. And by trying to save her, they only put themselves in more danger. So once again, we see themes of those traditional slasher films. Now, the child born turns out to be part human, part monster. And this mirrors the story of the Minotaur of Crete, where the queen of Crete had an affair with a bull, got pregnant, and the offspring turned out to be half bull, half human, a Minotaur, who preyed on youth and was eventually defeated by one of those youth. The father in Romulus isn't a bull, but he is the most aggressive character, and the mother does describe him as an a-hole. And of course, the injection of the mysterious goo implies that the monstrous xenomorph genes affected the offspring. So the theme in the last act of Romulus does mirror an ancient classic horror story. Now, the saddest scene is perhaps when the second xenomorph snuggles up to its mother before attacking. Here we're reminded that despite being a monster, it's also a baby, and perhaps some humanity is still left in it. Perhaps it is internally struggling between its innocent desire to love and be loved and its killer instinct. The mother also seems to be struggling to understand how to react. Well, eventually the second xenomorph falls into the planet's rings and gets killed. I use the word falls lightly here because I'm not sure the rings would have a strong enough gravity to force the xenomorph and the lower section of the ship to fall like that. And another note, planetary rings are not solid objects. They are made of many small pieces, some as small as dust particles and some the size of small moons. In the film, the ring kind of looks solid in some scenes, although that might just be the ship moving past them so fast that the small particles are blurred and look solid for that reason. So here's a question, why have rings at all? With the unlikelihood of a ring around a small rocky planet and the difficulty of making them look realistic, why not have an asteroid impact or something else collide with the station? Well, probably it's because rings are cool. They are beautiful and one of the most fascinating phenomena in astronomy, and that's a good enough reason. But even if unintended, they do add another thematic element to the story that works well with the android who keeps making puns. If the monsters represent the consequences for breaking the rules, including sexual rules, what destroys these horrors? Society's rules for sexual conduct, marriage, a ring, It's a pun. Now, I'm not sure the writers intended this connection, but who knows? Alien films are full of symbolism. But this might be an example of art taking a life of its own, where the audience make connections that the artist or author did not intend. Now, as for those puns, or quote-unquote dad jokes, coming from the android, well, the androids are depicted as rational and having no difficulty sacrificing a bit in order to save a lot. The humans are more emotional and instead follow their feelings into trouble. Rain's android was assigned to her by her father with the mission of protecting her. So in a way, the android represents a fatherly presence and strict rules or behavioral norms to protect her from emotionally driven decision-making. The character who impregnated the girl in the film has the most hate towards the androids and is likely the most emotional character too. Meanwhile, Rain goes through great lengths to keep her android by her side and even calls him her brother. He saves her a number of times and she escapes with him. So, we have a classic horror story. The emotional, rebellious youth are faced with horrors as a result of not following the rules. The one that defeats the monsters and escapes is the one that most effectively tames her behavior and remains more rational. Is that the meaning of the story? Well, it's certainly the meaning of countless other horror stories. So, till next time, enjoy.